It's a great pleasure and an honor to introduce Michael today and to welcome him back to the department for the 1003rd time. As Gay Seidman alluded to yesterday, he alluded to being a student of Michael's. I was also a student of Michael's. In fact, little known fact among people here, Gay and I were in the same cohort in graduate school. And at one time, there were 3 people from that cohort on the faculty in this department, only 2 of us Michael students. What many of you may not know is that, so Gay and I started at Berkeley a long time ago as graduate students, and we went there to work with Michael. And the year after we got there, Michael left. He came here. He took an appointment as a faculty member in this department, visiting, I think, but with the understanding he might stay if he didn't piss off too many people. Michael wrote about that. Let me just read you something that Michael said about leaving Berkeley and coming to Madison. Says, with my future uncertain, he was up. With my future uncertain, I went underground like solid. Taking up exile at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Exile or no exile, Madison was attractive in its own right. It was an altogether calmer place with a deep professional ethos, proud of rather than threatened by Marxist resurgence, which is, of course, why we have Michael here today. We've heard already how great Michael is. We know how famous he is, how good he is, how brilliant he is. So I'm just going to tell you an anecdote about Michael's time here in Madison. Doesn't appear in anything he wrote. When Michael was here, the year that Michael was here, he taught what became a very well-known course in participant observation. That's what we used to call ethnography. He was still developing that course when he taught it here. It was in the spring semester and it met at night. And it so happened that one of the meetings of the participant observation course conflicted with the broadcast finale of the television series MASH. And some of the students in the course requested of Michael that he reschedule the class so they could watch the broadcast finale of MASH. And Michael, of course, was aghast, just aghast that students would give up the intellectual vigor of his class for television. Television. Alas, even Michael could not compete with Alan Alda, at least not in 1983, maybe today. And so class got rescheduled. Now, I'm not certain what role the MASH episode played in Michael coming back to Berkeley, but he did, in fact, return to Berkeley the following year, very fortunately for Gay and myself and the roughly 83 other students who Michael has been a doctoral advisor for over the years, who have completed their dissertations under Michael. Michael's mentorship, his guidance, like his teaching, like his scholarship, is pretty legendary. I owe him an enormous gratitude, as do 83, 84, 85 other people, as does the profession. He's been one of the most amazing sort of teachers and producers of sociologists over the years. Today, Michael's going to speak about W.E.B. Du Bois and decolonizing the canon, incorporating the work of Du Bois into the theoretical canon in sociology in a more systematic way. From my perspective, this is a part of a project that Michael's been engaged in for a long time. His legendary undergraduate theory course at Berkeley was, at least in my view, always an attempt to rethink the canon, to rethink the relationship between the dead white forefathers of sociology and a whole host of urgent and insistent and resurgent voices from the peripheries or from outside the mainstream of sociology. The focus for Michael, I can speak for Michael, but the focus of that course was always on how those voices create a need to rethink, to reconstruct, and to reinvigorate the traditions of sociology. And always, 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 as befitting the Havens Rights Center, always at the core of that course has been a dialogue with Marxism, with issues of exploitation, issues of class in a world, global, and capitalist system. I take it that's the spirit in which we're hearing about Du Bois today. So, in the spirit of Erical and Wright and the welcoming of resurgent Marxism that Madison has always showed, we welcome Michael back with great affection and with great anticipation.
Thank you very much, Bob. I was it's getting embarrassing, these introductions. Yeah, I mean, of course, I could tell a few stories too.
Don't.
Super hostage taking.
The most famous story in connection with Bob and that he loved Berkeley so much. He's so devoted to Berkeley that he really didn't want to finish his dissertation. And I was getting increasingly anxious for him and for myself. So I held out a reward, the likes of which have never been offered to any graduate student in the history of the world. I offered him a Lexus car if he finished. You think he finished? He finished, and he got a Lexus car. Not the one he expected. It was a model Lexus car.
I still have.
Anyway, that was a wonderful introduction. Thank you very much, which sort of conveys the sorts of things I will be indeed talking about today. And of course, today I've got severe limits on my time because of the solar eclipse. So I will do my best to talk about this in 50 minutes, but promises are not always carried out. All right, 1 o'clock. So let me just say where we are in these probably excessively long lectures. In the first talk I gave, I talked about critical engagement, Du Bois's peculiar, well, not peculiar, but what I called his critical engagement, very much at odds, in my view, with the notion of public sociology. It was a critical engagement in the sense that he, for much of his life, was outside the university, engaging with the issues of the day, with a historical and sociological vision. But that engagement did not lead to what we might recognize to be systematic sociology, systematic theory, even theory as such. In the second lecture, I tried to suggest one way in which one might actually constitute his work is into something that might be theoretically recognizable. By taking one particular theme, namely the theme of race, class, and capitalism, and showing how his vision of the relationships between those three changed over time, and how one can thematize his work around the questions of the relationship between race, class, and capitalism. And in the process, we had a discussion, or I had a discussion about Cedric Robinson's view of Du Bois, particularly his magnum opus, Black Reconstruction, which Cedric Robinson interpreted as the foundation of a Black radical tradition. And I suggested that this didn't make sense, in my view, of the interpretation of Black Reconstruction that seemed to be eminently a Marxist work. But Robinson's used Du Bois in a very important way. Actually, the book, Black Marxism, The Making of a Black Radical Tradition, published in 1983, has become the foundation, the canonical work in the Black radical tradition. So even that engagement between Marxism on the one side and the Black radical tradition is another way in which we can think about Du Bois through a theoretical lens. And that I'm going to continue today. I'm going to trying to construct Du Bois's theory through dialogue. I'll give you an intimation of how one might construct a theory out of Du Bois through the dialogue of Du Bois with Marx, Weber, and Durkheim. And the next lecture on Wednesday will be a dialogue with Frantz Fanon. I want to begin by saying a little bit about how I got to be interested in W.B. Du Bois. It's relevant to what I want to say today. As Bob said, I teach this or taught this 2-semester undergraduate theory course for many, many years. And in the middle 90s, when it turned from a 1 quarter, then to a 2 quarter, then to a 2-semester course required of undergraduates, sociology majors, I experimented by introducing theories of race. And one of those was obviously W.E.B. Du Bois, Souls of Black Folk in particular, which was the only book I knew at that time. And it just did not fit. In the end, I chose Frantz Fanon, with whom I was very much more familiar and fitted into the Marxist theory that was the basis of the first semester. The next time I entered into an engagement with Du Bois was after I had read the first volume of David Levering Lewis's magnificent 2-volume biography of W.B. Du Bois, which, if you're looking for, there are many biographies and many interesting biographies of W.B. Du Bois, but that is the height of biography. Anyway, this was a fascinating account of Du Bois's life. And it was at this time also that I became president of the American Sociological Association. It was clear to me there was no other figure than W.B. Du Bois who represented the theme of the conference, which was public sociology. And I remember so vividly, we had an opening plenary on W.B. Du Bois as the greatest public sociologist that has ever lived in the United States and possibly the world. The panel was composed of Alden Morris, Patricia Hill Collins, Manning Marable, and Gerald Horne. So anybody who knows the area of Black studies knows these are extraordinary people, and it was an extraordinary plenary. You could have heard a pin drop, and it was really jam-packed. I was told I could never have a plenary on the eve of the ASA meetings, and I proved otherwise by virtue of bringing these 4 scholars together to talk about Du Bois. Well, at that time, I was engaged with the writings I may have mentioned earlier of Pierre Bourdieu. And I suffered for the next, actually, perhaps 14 years, no, 12 years, reading, rereading, trying to figure out Bourdieu and conducting a sort of Marxist conversations with Bourdieu. It was 2016 when I was just totally exhausted by Bourdieu that I invited Alden Morris to come to talk to us about his forthcoming book, Scholar Denied, which was about, many of you may know, about the life and work of W.B. Du Bois as the founder of US sociology. I invited him to what we call in Berkeley the Berkeley Sociology Forum, in which somebody's written a book, they summarize the book, and then subject to 3 critiques. They were extraordinary critiques. I particularly remember the one by Jason Ferguson, who was a graduate student at the time. And he essentially said to Alden, W.E.B. Du Bois cannot be reduced to a sociologist. You're missing so much of the contributions of Du Bois. And there ensued a vigorous exchange between him and Alden. And then I could see the students' faces lighting up, because after Jason had finished his 15 minutes, it was clear to them that was a whole new opening for social theory if we took seriously the scope of W.B. Du Bois. And it was at that moment that I was inspired by this discussion, to now take W.B. Du Bois very seriously. and I've given courses in Du Bois, introduced Du Bois into my theory courses, though it has never been easy. I might say first that Du Bois is relatively recent recovery for sociology. And whereas Marx, Weber, and Durkheim, we've been at it for 100 years trying to turn them into theorists. But so it's a very recent endeavor to turn Du Bois into theory. We have to give him a chance. We have to recognize the inequality between the sort of engagement with W.E.B. Du Bois as compared with Marx, Weber, and Durkheim. But anyway, what I want to say in this beginning is that what did and continues to strike me is what Jason Ferguson was exactly saying. You cannot reduce Du Bois to the founder of American sociology. Excuse me, all American sociologists, and I guess I'm one too. It is not the greatest sociology in the world, particularly in its beginnings. And to reduce Du Bois to an engagement with Robert Park seems to belittle the brilliance and the breadth and the vision of W.E.B. Du Bois. And I say, no, the discussion should not be between Du Bois and the Chicago School. Yes, Du Bois was antedated the Chicago School by 20 years. Yes, the Philadelphia Negro, as we've already said, is a classic work, canonical work in urban sociology. But that's shown before. And the real dialogue should go on, if we're talking about sociologists, between Du Bois and our canonical figures, those white guys from the 19th century, Marx, Weber, and Durkheim. And that eventually was what I will do today, or at least give you an intimation of what that dialogue will look like. Right. Yes. And what I'm going to do is, Alden actually in 2019 gave his presidential address to the American Sociological Association. And what he did in that address was, of course, to elevate Du Bois, but at the same time to dismiss Marx, Weber, and Durkheim. Why? Because they didn't deal with white supremacy, they didn't deal with colonialism, they didn't understand the significance of empire, and of course, they did not focus, except marginally, on race. So, sweep them away. So what I'm going to do today is do the same to Du Bois. So because Alden, in a sense, dismisses Marx, Weber, and Durkheim and embraces W.E.B. Du Bois as unproblematic, as a perfected body of theory. And I'm going to suggest today, and I'm going to, if I get there, but I will, I want to show you many of the blind spots of W.E.B. Du Bois and then pose the question of what we shall do with them. It's just a false engagement to sort of dismiss one set of theories and embrace another set. See the anomalies and contradictions in one and be blind to them in the other. Refute one and repress the anomalies in the other. So we have to, I'm going to argue that in fact, science develops through obsessing about anomalies and contradictions. And yes, it's important what Alden did to bring Du Bois to our attention. And he did it brilliantly and continues to do it brilliantly. But I think if the Du Boisian sociology is to develop, we have to obsess, not repress, but obsess about anomalies and contradictions. Sometimes we would call blind spots. So that's a prefiguration of what I want to do today. I'm going to talk about first, what the hell should we do with the canon? We got Du Bois, what do we do with the canon? And then I have to give you a little theory of the canon. Then I want to show you the dialogue between Du Bois and the canon. And by the canon, I mean Marx, Weber, and Durkheim. And then I'll talk about the blind spots of Du Bois. Okay. Beautiful. All right. Oh, by the way, before I begin, you may recognize these two characters, Chairman Mao and Du Bois, 1958, had a great discussion. Actually, I know of one reporting how each talked about mistakes they had made in their lives to one another. Would have been a bloody interesting discussion to witness. Yes. Anyway, that was 1958 when he recovered his passport and went on a tour of the world, like a victory tour, triumphal tour. Yes. All right. Let's move on. So, we're going to talk about what to do with the canon. Well, okay. Now, most of us who teach social theory, as you probably have noticed, have invested a lot of time in Marx, Weber, and Durkheim. And it's difficult for us to throw through it. So what do? We sort of, at the margins of the course, there's Marx, Weber, and Durkheim is at the core. And then at the margins, we introduce, well, Du Bois, feminism. Sometimes people like Simmel, perhaps, very rarely, Sigmund Freud. But anyway, the core remains. I don't know what happens here. Is there a classical theory course for graduate students? And what does it look like?
Much like what you just said. Yeah, we read Marx, Weber, Durkheim. We read a bunch of others too. And Bourdieu, yeah.
And Bourdieu, I forgot about Bourdieu, excuse me. Yes. Well, of course, that's another candidate for the canon. So anyway, that's one strategy, restoration. Second strategy, rejection. Well, there are two forms of rejection of the canon. There is the post-colonial rejection, namely the rejection that I just described for Alden and for others, that essentially the canon does not deal with what we regard today as the pressing issues around race, colonialism, empire. Yes, and of course, feminism. Now, feminism is interesting because it has always been, in a sense, outside the canon, critical of the canon. Yes. Now, that's another separate discussion. So one basis is the post-colonial, but there's another basis of rejection. And that is the positivist rejection of the canon. Oh, these three guys, they're from the 19th century. They're outdated. Their method is anachronistic. They had a limited vision of the world. We really need to be doing science today. They didn't do science. So yes, there is a positivist. And those who are enthusiastic about the post-colonial rejection should be aware that that might mean that we become what? A suburb of the economics department. Beware for what you ask for. So anyway, that's the rejection project. The third is a revolution. That we actually just don't reject the idea of the canon, but we actually transform the canon. And it's in a sense, those who talk about a Du Boisian revolution have this imagination. I think, I don't put words in the mouth of Alden, but I think he very much committed to a Du Boisian revolution in sociology. And perhaps it's best expressed in the book by Itzigson and Brown, Du Boisian sociology. Yeah. So that's the revolutionary perspective. And I'm going to be talking a lot about the reconstruction perspective. That we reconstruct the canon, think about the relationships of Marx, Weber, and Durkheim in relationship to new candidates, and then begin to reread Marx, Weber, and Durkheim, and perhaps even remove one or more of them, but through dialogue. But to actually develop that idea, I have to give you an idea what I mean by the canon. the theory of the canon. First, the canon is basically foundational works. People are reluctant, particularly the post-colonialists who want to get rid of the very idea of the canon, are reluctant to say what makes for good theory. Very reluctant. And I think we can't avoid that. For many of the post-colonialists, like Raewyn Connell, almost anything goes. But anything doesn't go. So, in my view, and this is just my view of what counts as the fundamental features of foundational theory, a theory of history, you have to have a theory of history. I remember I had lots of fights with graduate students around Bourdieu, because they always wanted to study Bourdieu as the contemporary theorist with whom to engage. And I said, no, Bourdieu is not a serious theorist. He hasn't got a theory of history. Well, then I got converted. I took him very seriously. But for a long time, in fact, it was only the battles I had with graduate students that led me to engage with Bourdieu. But that is a sideline. The second feature, conception of society. Very nebulous idea in most of the canonical workers, but they have a sense of the social. And the social cannot be reduced to the economic or the political. I think of sociology as taking as theorizing from the standpoint of civil society. You study other parts of the economy and the polity from the standpoint. But anyway, some notion of society is essential for the candidates for the canon, at least as far as sociological theory is concerned. A distinctive methodology. And it is true that Marx, Weber, and Durkheim all developed a very distinctive methodology and exemplified it. I mean, the Durkheim Suicide is an extraordinary book, just as Marx's Capital is another extraordinary deductive theorization of capitalism. And Weber's immense corpus also spells out. And in fact, I believe that Weber's methodology essays are the most sophisticated essays we still have to this day. I recommend you read them if you haven't, or if you have, read them again. And fourth, these all, I believe, a canonical theory has a moral standpoint. It's a moral science. That is true of Marx, Weber, and Durkheim, and of course of Du Bois. There is underneath Weber notions of freedom, for Durkheim, notions of solidarity, for Marx, notions of egalitarianism. And we could argue about whether these are an accurate rendition of the canonical theorists, but they all are rooted in a morality, a political vision too. So that has to be there, it seems, if we're going to have canon. Foundational. Right. Second, historical canons are not fixed. The canon really, as we know it, as we did know it anyhow, was invented by Talbot Parsons, who wrote The Structure of Social Action, another brilliant book showing the convergence, or trying to show the convergence of the theories of social action in Marshall, Pareto, Durkheim, and Weber. And then he himself dropped, once he realized that actually this was catching on, not just in sociology, but in the social sciences. He didn't have to pay obeisance to economics, so he dropped Marshall and Pareto. So we had Marx, and then we had Durkheim and Weber. And then what happens? Social movements in the 1960s called into question the fundamental postulates of Parsons' ideas, namely, they were all his theories based on value consensus. This did not make sense given the social movements of the 1960s and 70s, and in comes Marx. But as we bring in Marx, we reread Weber, we reread Durkheim, we see them through a different lens. Yeah. So that's historical. Which brings me to the next point. The relations among a canon is not made up of atoms, of atomized theories, but it's a set of relations among theorists. Now, for Parsons, that relationship was a relationship of convergence. They were all converging simultaneously or around the similar time in history, turn of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, convergence on a single theory of social action, the voluntaristic theory of action. Yes. Yes. And what happens today, or after the incorporation of Marx, we have not a convergent canon, a divergent canon. We have three different research programs emanating from Marx, Weber, and Durkheim. And the interesting thing is a discussion and debate between these programs, between the three, and the different perspectives they have on the world. That is of the wonders of sociology, in my view. This dialogue amongst fundamental theorists. Yes. Yes. And so sociology looks very chaotic compared with economics. But that's so wonderful. Why is it chaotic? Because civil society, the standpoint of civil society, is itself a standpoint of a very chaotic world. Civil society is a vibrant, conflicting, marginalizing process. And we should indeed recognize that these are three different perspectives, cannot be reduced to one another, but each will learn from the other through dialogue. And obviously, I'm implying you bring Du Bois in, then we have new dialogues, new readings of Marx, Weber, and Durkheim. And finally, the tricky one. I think the canon is also geographical. If it's historical, it's geographical. And somehow, Marx, Weber, and Durkheim have been transmitted to the furthest corners of the world. And that may be a function of the division of knowledge, global division of knowledge, and the power of the West, the power of the United States, the resources that actually have defined the canon. And you'll find the most strongest defense of the old canon in precisely the global South, or as I used to find in the Soviet Union. Why? Because the canon actually represented a critique, as rendered in the West, was represented as a critique of Soviet society. Sociologists were able to establish a critical perspective in those moments of openness in the history of the Soviet Union by drawing upon Western theory. But this is what we struggle with, in my view, with Du Bois. He is so American in so many ways, which I hope to get to in a few minutes. I remember giving a talk to Chinese sociologists and Du Bois, one of my early attempts at bringing Du Bois to other countries. And many were scratching their heads. You have to know, as I hope is apparent already, you have to know a lot about US history to begin to appreciate Du Bois. And it is very much rooted, as I will show today, it is very much rooted in the issues, challenges, problems that Du Bois faced in the United States. Though he had a global vision, that vision was one from the United States. And so this is an interesting question. In India, in China, in Africa, what do you do with Du Bois? I've given not these lectures, but some lectures on Du Bois in South Africa, given in India, and I always find how difficult it is to persuade them that they should take Du Bois seriously for those reasons I've just stated. All right. Now, Well, we're going to get into the business now. We're going to do the dialogue. I've suggested to you, what to do with a canon. I'm suggesting to you, I'm in the business of reconstructing the canon. Then I talked about the theory of the canon. And now let us put this idea of canonical dialogues to work. There we are, Marx, Weber, and Durkheim. And I believe after Parsons, after the end of structural functionalism, there was and has been a very interesting dialogue amongst these three, which led to a rereading. I mean, the way we read Weber, the way we read Durkheim today is profoundly different from the way Parsons read Durkheim and Weber. Yeah, all right. There's our man. Well, Philadelphia Negro. Yeah. If you read the Philadelphia Negro with a Durkheimian lens, you can only draw the conclusion that Du Bois was a Durkheimian, not before Durkheim, but at the same time as Durkheim, but unaware of Durkheim. If I may say so, if we consider the account of the African Americans in the 7th Ward, what one sees there are the abnormal forms of the division of labor. You all look blank. Third book of the division of labor. The Parsons never dealt with, but had to be included once there was a dialogue between Marx and Durkheim. The third book. Do anybody remember the title of the third book? Nobody remembers.
I think I do.
Oh, very good. You see, well trained.
Abnormal forms of the division of labor.
The abnormal forms of the division of labor. Very good. Yes. Before there was all about the normal forms, and that's the only forms that Parsons was interested in. But Durkheim was really interested in the abnormal forms because those abnormal forms were the forms that actually were in the society around him. He thought that the abnormal will become normal, and how was never very clear, but he had an analysis. And what were the abnormal forms?
Anomic force, then I don't remember beyond that.
Yes, the third one. He calls it a third one. Very good. Let's stick with the anomic and force. Anomic division of labor is a division of labor that is characterized by disorganization, a state of normlessness, anomie. Which many people think we're in a state of anomie in this society at this point in time. The forced division of labor was a division of labor in which people were forced into positions for which they were not equipped. So the criteria of being forced into positions that we are not equipped, the assumption is that we are equipped, talented to do certain things, and we should, in the best of all societies where there is organic solidarity, we should find our place in the division of labor. That is true to our talents. Yeah. But in society, there are all sorts of obstacles for that. Durkheim was very focused on the inequality of wealth that was impeding the possibility of people finding their true place in the division of labor. And he therefore called for what? The elimination of the inheritance of wealth. That is already bloody radical. And if you read very carefully the fourth division of labor chapter, you will see that he's also got a notion of division of labor, abnormal division of labor, based on discrimination, on the basis of race, and argued that we should have affirmative action. This is a radical characterization of modern society. And I think you can find exactly the same sort of arguments in Philadelphia Negro. Du Bois is very aware of the transition from a society based on slavery to one with emancipation, in quotes. And that transition itself creates disorganization, the disorganization that he witnessed in the 7th Ward in Philadelphia. And of course, he focused very much on the discrimination against African Americans in the 7th Ward, racial discrimination against them, fighting against them. This was, of course, radical for its time, but let me underline, this was a very Durkheimian argument. And of course, he had a vision which becomes clear at the end of organic solidarity, in which these barriers to people finding their true place for a more stable society, he saw this organic solidarity emerging, fascinatingly enough, through the development of a changing collective consciousness. He urged whites to take more seriously their supposed ideology around equality, and urged African Americans to take more seriously their commitment to their place in society, in the division of labor. The book is about the division of labor, and it just looks like Durkheim transplanted to the 7th Ward. Only, of course, race is central to the analysis, in a way, of course, it was not for Durkheim. That is the sort of dialogue one can have. Of course, it goes both ways. I'm just at this moment suggesting, yes, there's a real Durkheimian Weber, of a Durkheimian Du Bois. And if you read The Souls of Black Folk, you get similar ideas of the potentiality of human collectivity, very much in line with Durkheim's conception of organic solidarity. And as I've said before, there was little attempt to actually talk about capitalism or to talk about class as Marxists understand it, still hanging on to a very Durkheimian notion of stratification. Well, I could go on, but I'll stop there. Actually, The Souls of Black Folk, we could go on to talk more about the dialogue between Durkheim and the content of Souls of Black Folk. What's her name? She actually has a beautiful essay. What is her name? Damn it. Yep. Yeah, Karen Fields, right. She was the translator of Elementary Forms of Religious Experience, and she wrote a wonderful essay, a conversation between Durkheim and Du Bois, describing Du Bois as a inside without. He was and trying to suggest that Durkheim was an outsider within. Anyway, no, it's the other way around. That Du Bois was an outsider within, and Durkheim was an insider without. And she tried to show the parallels in their lives and the way they constructed the world. On the one hand, a Jew, on the other hand, a African American. Anyway, I've got to move on because there's eclipse. Weber. Yes, Weber. Cool. You know, there's so much stories about Weber and Du Bois. I mean, Alden himself makes a lot of Weber's relationship to Du Bois, right, demonstrating that Weber thought that Du Bois was the cat's pajamas of sociology, but particularly sociology of the South, and particularly of what he was particularly interested in at the time when he visited the United States in 1904, repressive agriculture. You know, they make much of the correspondence. The interesting thing about the correspondence is how short it was, and how brief, and how with very little content. So, yes, it was short because ultimately Weber and Du Bois, this is not a convergent story. This is a divergent story. Weber, as we all know, was a bourgeois sociologist, political ambitions, to be sure, interestingly, but he was very committed to a national bourgeois project, a project of imperialism. That was not Du Bois's. We know enough already to know that that was not Du Bois's project. If you think of his origins, reproduction, and future of capitalism, according to Max Weber, even if you were just to stick with the Protestant spirit of capitalism, you know that the origins of this peculiar thing called Western civilization for Weber originated in the West, because in the West they developed a particular form of Protestantism, ultimately Calvinism, which propelled the development of capitalism. Yes. That accentuated the importance of accumulation for accumulation's sake, money for money's sake, which is, by the way, how Du Bois was brought up in Great Barrington. But the point is, Du Bois says, yes, Western civilization is superior. Yes, it's superior. But why? Because it expropriated from everywhere else that which was worth expropriating, i.e., because of imperialism itself. And that doesn't stop. For Weber, once you get capitalism, it keeps on reproducing itself of itself without any necessary religious input that becomes at best a legitimation force for the reproduction of capitalism. But for Du Bois, the violence of imperialism, and we've talked about the two imperialisms, the violence of imperialism continues in the reproduction of capitalism. And the future? Weber says, oh, you socialists, he's writing in the 1890s, 1910s, you socialists, you want to struggle for socialism? You want a revolution? You're going to eliminate all that? No, not all that. But the most treasured part of capitalism, namely the democratic, liberal democratic part of capitalism, will get destroyed by any attempt to move beyond capitalism. You will be left with a dictatorship of who? Officials. And of course, there's a lot of truth in what Weber had to say. But Du Bois, writing in 1920 in Darkwater, which I'm making the key text here, Du Bois has got a vision of socialism in the future, a planned socialism, a socialism that is democratic, that includes everybody based on their lived experience. Yeah, so if you read Darkwater seriously, you have a very different imagination of the past, the present, and the future. There is a real struggle here between Weber and Du Bois. Oops. All right. Whoops, I'm doing pretty good. Now, Marx, I could go on and on forever, but I'm not going to. I've already said. But one of the interesting things, before I say, Du Bois comes to Marx pretty late, always complains that his teachers never taught him Marx. Why the hell he couldn't study it by himself, I'm not sure. Why he didn't pick it up when he was in Germany between 1892 and 94, attending social democratic parties. Well, he says somewhere that actually he was just very confused by all the debates. I mean, come on. Because I think that he internalized the contempt for Marx of his teachers, both in Germany, in Fisk. Well, Fisk didn't even talk about Marx, and in Harvard to the extent that they did. And then he never took Marx seriously until he went to Soviet Union in 1926 and came back a convinced Bolshevik. And then he started, with the help of young African Americans who were already committed to to the writings of Marx. With their help, he began to absorb and eventually, by 1935, produced this extraordinary book, how in so few years he was able to reconstruct his prior understanding of the Civil War and Reconstruction and post-Reconstruction. In such few years, he was extraordinary feat. And has a very original vision of Marxism that does indeed center race as well as class. And so, indeed, he never lets go, as I said last time, of his Marxism. His Marxism looks ever more like Lenin's imperialism, highest stage of capitalism. So, yes, and those are the books one goes to where it is delineated. So what I'm suggesting, and once again, I'm periodizing Du Bois, tricky thing to do, but nevertheless, I am. In the beginning, he's a convergence with Durkheim. He's then having, in my rendition of this imaginary conversation, a hostile relationship to Weber. And it's a very short correspondence. And then his adoption of Marx and his development of Marx. And next time I will talk about Black Marxism as something that a series of Marxists have in common. Black Marx, and we'll have to sort of interrogate the concept of black as we do that. Anyway, I want to move on here. So what have we got here? Challenging the canon and challenging Du Bois. In what ways did Du Bois challenge the canon as a result of these dialogues? Well, we talked about critical engagement. Professional sociology has a limited notion of engagement. Du Bois offers a vision of racialized capitalism. Alden, Hitzigson, and Brown, they talk about racialized modernity. That's sort of Durkheimian approach to modernity. They don't use the word capitalism, but Du Bois does. Anyway, racialized capitalism running through Du Bois's work, particularly after 1920. An experiential science that Du Bois is part of the world he is studying, but self-consciously so. And finally, a reflexive science that, in a sense, is more than just being conscious that one is part of the world one is studying, but also that one is continually rethinking one's assessment, or sometimes one's rudimentary theory of the world as one engages in the world that is self-changing. So he writes 3-4 autobiographies, and Souls of Black Folk, Darkwater, and his last posthumously published biography. And the other thing, the importance, not just of a moral science, but a utopian science, that we have to imagine a world other than the world in which we live. It becomes ever more important the longer capitalism continues. All right, now, challenging of Du Bois. Well, I think one has to begin systematizing Du Bois to actually extract and create out of Du Bois's works a way of engaging the world that gives us insight into the world it is today. I have to abstract from his history and then project that into the future. Periodizing Du Bois, recognizing how he shifts his perspectives. And that, of course, is difficult with Du Bois because he is going backwards, forwards, as well as shifting his view. Well, we talked about that last time. Sociologizing Du Bois. Well, what can Du Bois tell us about social movements, about political sociology, about the state, about race? And indeed, Alden has just edited with a few others an encyclopedia of Du Bois. And the essays in that encyclopedia that should come out sooner or later are an attempt to actually bring Du Bois into the present and engage with questions that we recognize as sociologists today. And I think also the other thing that I think that we could do more with in Du Bois is a more careful comparative history that is not just the method of agreement, but also the method of difference. But what I want to do is really talk about blind spots in my remaining -2 minutes. Let me do it, please. This is very important. Blind spots of Du Bois. I want to talk about he seemed to be a global sociologist. Well, let's have a look. Racial democracy in Brazil and Cuba. Fascinating how he sees miscegenation, or he did see in the period the teens of the 20th century, 1910 to 1920, changed his mind later, but he saw that miscegenation in Brazil, the absence of formal segregation, was an alternative way forward. And he thought, yes, Brazil, racial democracy. I think I've already talked a little bit about that. And he saw Cuba in a similar sort of way. And insofar as Cuba did not approximate to racial democracy, it was because of the imperial presence of the United States. But he changed his mind, particularly in relationship to Brazil, when Afro-Brazilians were recognized by those who came to Brazil, when African Americans came to Brazil and saw racism. I said that last time, I think. All right, colonial Africa. He goes to Africa before 1961, only once, to Liberia in 1923 as a representative of the US president. And yes, he sees the wonders of African Americans running Liberia. And therefore he concludes this is the answer. He doesn't talk about the colonized. African Americans, of course, cannot, in his imagination at the time, be also colonizers. All right, changed his mind in 1933. Okay, so Soviet Union, another interesting perspective. He goes there 1936, 1949, 1958. Never shifts his loyalty to the Soviet Union and tries to sweep under the carpet many of the excesses, the purges, the authoritarian character of the Soviet Union. Riveted to their idea that the Soviet Union's project was anti-colonial, was anti-race, was for an egalitarian society. And that's what he saw in 26, and he never gave up that idea. National Socialism, Germany, fascism. He goes there in 1936 and writes all sorts of ambiguous, ambivalent statements about what is going on in Germany. In 1941, he pens an article called Europa, where he lauds the rationalization of the German economy and says, oh, this racism is going to go away. So he's looking everywhere to see the planned economy as a vision of the foundation of socialism. Well, he changes his mind. He visits in 1949, he visits the Warsaw Ghetto. And then in 1952, writes an amazing account of how he saw Nazism, Holocaust, and how he has now to actually, and he was probably thinking of this long before 52, but nevertheless, how you have to reconceptualize the nature of race as not only founded on color. Yeah. National liberation, Palestine. Well, he's not the only African American that embraced an Israeli state, who supported the case for Israel, the title of one of his articles in the Chicago Star. Yes, again, Palestinians don't exist in his assessment of basically the Jews are fighting for national independence against the Brits. And indeed, they are facing that struggle. But there's another struggle going on too, we don't hear much about. He shifts his mind in 1956 when he sees how the Israeli state is collaborating with the French and the British state around the Suez crisis. And it is the Israeli Jews who become the shock troops for the invasion of Egypt. He shifts his position. Then we could talk about Africa and how he sees the post-colonial trajectory as one in which you invite Chinese capital, Soviet capital, and leave out Western capital. But there's no sense of what we will learn about on Wednesday, no sense of the struggles that go on and the different class interests that are involved in the struggle against colonialism and afterwards. The struggles that he emphasized so deeply in his own analysis of Civil War reconstruction. Am I nearly there? Yes, all right. With these blind spots, you say, well, we better throw the guy out. We can't handle this. Well, or we can do what? Under the carpet, repress the anomalies and the contradictions, the so-called blind spots. Well, my view, of course, is we've got to first explain them. He had limited knowledge and experience. He was searching for alternatives. He was a bit of an elitist and focused very much on elites as really defining the direction of societies. But this is really the one I want to emphasize, that he was taking the standpoint of the US. He was looking at other societies, yes, in terms of what alternatives they offered, but also the ways in which they contested the US state. And he became ever more convinced of the evilness of US imperialism as his life went on and as he became an enemy of that same state. So I think his vision of the rest of the world was very much stamped by his own political trajectory. So what one can do is with these, and I think one has, and it's a challenge, we shouldn't hide these blind spots or these anomalies. One way is to go back to Black Reconstruction and reconstruct his understanding of the countries in which he was engaged. That is one way to proceed, because there is really a divergence in the way he treats the origins of the Civil War, how it's prosecuted, the Reconstruction, and what happens afterwards. It's much more of a deeper class, race analysis and the balance of forces in different places, both from below and above. Extraordinary analysis. All the alternative is, well, other Black Marxists to the rescue. And that's where I'll talk about on Wednesday, how Fanon and Du Bois complement each other in the way that they grapple with the world. And I'm only 10 minutes late, but I'm finished.
You mentioned that there's this confusion or reticence because of Du Bois's embeddedness in American history and American society of scholars who are not working on the United States and how to take them up, how to interpret them. I was wondering if you found variation with that, specifically whether there's more openness to Du Bois in countries that share this legacy of like settler colonial planter economies in the Atlantic. I'm specifically thinking of like Brazil, Cuba, Caribbean more broadly, or whether you run into the same problem there.
Well, I haven't actually talked about Du Bois in that part of the world. No, that's not true. I gave a talk in Brazil, Sao Paulo, but yes, I think it would be a reasonable conjecture that it is indeed more meaningful Caribbean, Latin America, with the history of slavery and the variety of histories of slavery, which makes it even really a comparative study in a Du Boisian framework. And once we give up the idea of racial democracy, which, is an interesting episode in the history of sociology, particularly in Brazil itself, where it was, of course, and still to some extent is today, the ideology of Brazil. We have a democracy because we do not have the segregation that you have in the United States. So that's an interesting variable that one would obviously want to take into account, and his analysis of Cuba equally. But yes, no, I think you're absolutely right. I think there's more chance that there is the Americas Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I think that they would appreciate. I mean, Brazilians I know are very interested in Du Bois. There's no doubt in my mind about that. In a way that, you know, in China, I mean, many countries they feel they should be because, well, there's a hierarchy in the global production of knowledge. And well, if these bloody Americans are interested in Du Bois, we better follow because we want to publish our articles in US journals. I mean, so there is that dimension of the interest in Du Bois, but an intrinsic interest would emerge indeed in the Americas. I think that's a very good point. Yeah. Yeah.
So I was interested about the decolonization part. So, like you mentioned, Du Bois, I think primarily focused on the decolonization of sociology as a subject in America. But what about, say, in other places, like in the world, like say in China, because people are clearly less interested in Du Bois because it's less related to the Chinese problems, and pretty sure about that. And and they're more focused on the canon like Marx, Weber, and Durkheim for now. And so what about decolonization of the sociology in other countries?
Yes, well, China is a very interesting example. So, and when I gave talk to on Zoom, there were 4 serious commentators, and they all differed about the significance of Du Bois, but there was a strong view that this is another form of US hegemony. Yeah, because Du Bois is centrally interested in race. That's how they understood Du Bois. And that's a minor problem in China. But if they got really interested in Du Bois, they might see race in China too. You never know. It's not actually absent, as we know, in China. So, yes, I think this is the $1 million question. I mean, what is so interesting is that actually the Du Bois of Souls of Black Folk and the Philadelphia Negro is the one that is exported, the most conservative of Du Bois's perspectives. And perhaps if people had a recognition of the transformation of Du Bois's ideas, particularly were able to engage with Black reconstruction, I think that might actually invigorate sociologies elsewhere. But that's asking a lot. I showed you how thick that book was. And it's really a history book within a Marxist frame, very much a Marxist frame. Yes, I think that's an open question. Let's see what will happen to Du Bois globally. But it is, as you said, China, Marx, Weber, and Durkheim still need to be canonical. But that wasn't spontaneous. That took time. Then gets consolidated. Professors like myself in China have a vested interest in that canon. So the next generation may be able to find all sorts of ways of bringing Du Bois into dialogue with challenges of China. And the critique of Du Bois, too, is very narrow vision of China. Yeah. Yes. The future is open.
Thank you for the thoughts. I was wondering, is there really value in, I guess, thinking about Du Bois's applicability in other contexts, more so than putting Du Bois in conversation with other social theorists around the world? Partially because I wonder what must be done to work towards like global social theory dialogue that isn't just about centering US ideas of decolonization and racial capitalism, but putting in conversation with elsewhere.
Yes, well, I like the India story. So there, Du Bois was infatuated by Gandhi, and whom he saw as the central leader of the national independence struggle of India from British Empire. And in India, they see Du Bois differently. They see Du Bois having a conversation with Ambedkar. Ambedkar was the theorist of caste. He was concerned with what would happen in the post-colonial world to caste, to the Dalits. And so, funnily enough, Du Bois had one letter. Everybody quotes it, but the letter has no content. It's just an exchange. They recognize the existence of each other. Why do people associate Ambedkar with Du Bois? Because Du Bois takes the idea of color caste early on. Even you can find mentions of color caste even in the Philadelphia Negro, which is 1899. So they think, therefore, because Du Bois uses the concept of caste, he must be close to Ambedkar. So an Ambedkarite sociology in India could indeed have an interesting conversation with Du Bois. And it doesn't matter that Du Bois didn't see the world through Ambedkar's eyes in India, but there is a way of actually seeing a conversation between the two, which I think is what is going on. Yeah, no, I think that's right. The insertion of Du Bois into debates elsewhere will have some significance. So it gives, in a sense, the way it's constructed, I think Du Bois gives energy and imagination to an Ambedkarite perspective on India, rather than a Gandhian or Nehruvian. Yeah, and that can happen, of course, in other countries too. South Africa is always an interesting story. And there are people there who are sort of interested, but very few interested. In fact, Du Bois really didn't make much headway in Africa. When I was there, 4 years studying seriously sociology, didn't come across Ambedkar. I didn't come across Du Bois. This was 68 to 72. And yeah.
Southern Africa.
Southern Africa. So Du Bois didn't enter the discussion. He was out of touch with actually the colonial and post-colonial struggles. So, but the question is whether his ideas will make their way, particularly to a country like South Africa. There are obviously wonderful comparative studies about the history of colonialism and post-colonialism, segregation, apartheid in South Africa, comparing with the United States. So yes, Du Bois could begin to enter into that sort of discussion and debate. We'll see. This discovery of Du Bois in sociology is really very new. And so we'll see how it goes. But I think all of you are right that this extending Du Bois to other parts of the world is not going to be easy.
Can you guys hear me on that side of the pond?
Beautiful.
Yes.
Okay. David Jameson here in Glasgow. I'm the co-editor of Conta.Scot. I was fascinated by the whole talk, but I was particularly fascinated by Du Bois' sort of erratic affinities to various different regimes. So the Soviet Union, of course, changes a great deal between the 1920s and the 1950s. I was stunned. I didn't know about his even partial, celebration of Nazi economic policy. I believe as well, and tell me if I'm wrong, that he was a supporter of Japanese imperialism at various points, or at least had some sympathies. I've got kind of two questions based on that. The first is about the Soviet Union. He would be far from the only left-wing intellectual in this period to make apologies. Oh, and I forgot to mention Zionism as well. He wouldn't be unusual in maintaining sympathy for the Soviet Union throughout its years of changes. And I was wondering if that, in his case, though, could be explained by its perceived anti-colonial role. And relatedly, given that all of these regimes in different ways related to the racial question, does it perhaps indicate the instability of race as a politics for forming a kind of world view? Did it lead him into a series of kind of blind alleys or confusions or contradictory positions, constantly using the racial question as the anchor for his relationships to real politics in the world. So those are my questions, and thanks very much for the talk.
I can go. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. No, I think that's very good. I think, yes, I think there are a number of things going on. I emphasize the anti-imperial focus of Du Bois's analysis of specific world contexts, looking at, and you mentioned Japan, I didn't mention Japan, but one could mention Japan in the 1930s was seen to be as an alternative hegemonic power that would be a challenge to the United States. So there is the anti-imperial, but there is, as you say, the race question. And Du Bois, because he, in the end, was very pessimistic about the possibility of interracial class solidarity, particularly in the books Color and Democracy and then Africa and the World, 45 and 47. He's there imagining the union of the darker races of the world forging a revolution. And insofar as he focuses on that, he tends to lose the specificities of each of these countries, whether it be India, Japan, China. He's putting them all together. And I think that's, again, that's another way of thinking about how he loses the specificity, how he is, again, the despair with which he sees the tensions and conflicts between white labor and black labor. And he puts it beautifully at the end of Black Reconstruction, saying these are two fractions of the working class that have something fundamentally in common and yet hate one another in ways that make that completely impossible. So he's despairing of that, and his hope then turns to the idea of a revolution of the darker races, which he doesn't have a lot of evidence for, and therefore has to write a novel about it. Dark Princess, 1928, is really about the possibility of a revolution on the basis of the darker races. So I think, yes, the race question does obviously concern him as much as the anti-imperial question, and of course they are related. So yes, I think that's my answer to your question. Even though you're not quite there yet. I'll say.
So I want to push back on the description of him as an elitist. Because I think the elitism that I see in the work that I've read, which is nothing like as much as you've read of his work, is much more about insisting that African Americans have talent and skills and need to be listened to. And that so much of his work is actually about saying we're humans, and that some of it comes across as elitist, but I think you have to be really careful with that. And in particular, I was thinking about it in relation to the way that he engages Marx, because so many of the Pan-Africanist leaders that he met with beginning in 1900 in Paris, I guess, or 1904, whatever it was, and then like these repeated meetings, Sekou Touré, the Negritude movement, there's often, I wouldn't call it elitism. I think it's an assertion of, in a world where modernization, the civilizational argument, what was the civilizational mission of imperialism, is so widely accepted as a sort of normal thing. I think they're playing to that, as opposed to elitism per se. It's saying we're civilized also, which is a little bit different than imperialism. Because just think by 1920, when he's talking about, former sharecroppers moving to Chicago and organizing class. I mean, he's not ignoring the needs of people who are poor.
Now, this is the tension. I think you're absolutely right. That you look at Souls of Black Folk, one of the remarkable things of the Souls of Black Folk is the deep ethnography of the African Americans, sharecroppers,
And sympathy.
and sympathy. So he has a subalternist perspective. And of course, in Black Reconstruction. The point of Black Reconstruction, or a small point, I mean, because there are so many points, but one crucial point is the agency of African Americans, the enslaved. So, that runs through much of his writings, particularly, I mean, it's a shock for him to go to the South when he's at Fisk University and to see what has happened to Reconstruction and what has happened to Reconstruction under Jim Crow. And so, yes, he is able to, and his novels also are an expression of his empathy for the subordinated. So you have a subaltern perspective. However, when it comes to solutions to the world's problems, I believe still that there is a sort of latent and sometimes blatant elitism. He does believe in the talented tenth. He never hides that. The talented tenth, the idea that the talented tenth, the superior African Americans, they will have solutions for Africa. They have solutions for the United States. But what he sees is that talented tenth, which he expected them to be accountable to African Americans as a whole, they become increasingly driven by their class interests. And that is what happens to his talented tenth, his so-called elitism in the 1950s, in my view, that he has to reconcile the reality that African Americans, professionals, skilled workers, those who are relatively well off, are increasingly concerned with their own interests, and they are less committed and interested in his leftward drift of his own politics. So yes, he has a very, I think you're absolutely right. In his descriptions of the world, he has a subaltern perspective, and that is really what is novel and what is so appealing. But in his solutions, he really does place a lot of emphasis. Since he was a boy graduating, who does he writes in his commencement addresses at Harvard, he actually he talks about Jefferson Davis, who was the president of the Confederacy, and Fisk, he's talking about Bismarck. He has a faith in leaders too. So that's the tension. We're going to say something good.
Well, it's just, I don't think it's any more than, say, Weber or Durkheim, who have a fair amount of that too.
Oh, wow. Well, yeah, well, we don't disagree about that. No, absolutely. I'm going to think about Marx too as a complicated story.
Or Lenin and
Lenin. Very good. So yes, no, that does not sort of separate him from the others. Yes, no, you're absolutely right. Yeah, Lenin is
hardline.
It's really interesting. Well, you've got a strong view of Lenin. But no, that's what is most interesting. I guess I should end. But what's most interesting is how so many ideas seem to be so close to Lenin's. When he writes about in 1914 the African roots of war, it is precisely Lenin's argument, imperialism, higher stage of capitalism. And the whole idea of the labor aristocracy becomes so important to his understanding of the US and the imperial order. Again, these are all Lenin ideas, but I can't find any reference to Lenin. There's one essay I found, an empty essay, just ritually acknowledging Lenin. And I can only believe, and this has always been a puzzle to me, I can only believe that he's mixing in a world where Lenin is just taken for granted. And so he doesn't actually, and in 1920, he's citing the ideas and sometimes the phrases of the German ideology, which was available to nobody at the time, but it must have been ideas circulating. So I think that is the message. When we treat Du Bois and think about his ideas, we have to be aware of the community within which he's mixing. We have to be, again, much more historical in the way that we treat his arguments.